laid out very clearly where the Grayson religion comes from, and how it differs. I've had people go to me, I don't believe in religion. I find the church and the men have changed. And I say, well, if you go out the door, down 3 streets, there's a Methodist church. And you'll find most of the elements of Grayson's religion, not necessarily the exaggerated patriarchy and whatnot, elements of the Grayson religion, the doctrine of the testament, it's something called the Wesleyan quadrilateral. Okay, John Wesley never used the term and would have hated it, and the guy who invented it was a religious theologian and religious historian who later said that's the worst thing I ever did. Because when you call something a quadrilateral, you imply that all 4 parts of it are equally weighted in the final structure. And Wesley would not have weighted them equally. Okay. But essentially, the Wesleyan quadrilateral is that, let's see, we learn to know God, okay, through the experience of those who come before us, the church fathers, through the reading of the original texts, through the Holy Spirit and God's grace moving us to examine this in the first place, and by the use of our own intellect, our own intelligence, to choose between conflicting interpretations of gospel based on our understanding of what the church fathers had said, etc. And so the Grayson doctrine of the test rests on the fact that the Graysons recognize that there will always be more for us to learn, and that we should use the test of our own faith and our own intelligence to figure out what it is he's trying to tell us. All right? And that really is what's at the heart of the Church of Humanity Unchained and religion on Grayson. And it is what simultaneously makes them intensely conservative and open to innovation in ways that many other societies aren't. Their religious construct requires them, as Cromwell said, you know, I pray you, my brethren, to consider whether or not you might be mistaken. Okay, and through the advertising time, I'm a Methodist lay speaker. Okay, so this obviously, but I was raised even high church Episcopalian. My parents were Episcopalian. My mother's grandparents were Methodists, so I was in and out. And I was high church Episcopalian enough that I could go to Mass and know exactly where we were, even though I didn't speak Latin, because Cranmer just grabbed their liturgy and translated it, and I knew where they were, But I fell away from the church, as I think many people did for many years before I came back. And I think it's probably fairly clear from what I write, okay, that religion faith plays a big part in my own worldview and my own life. And by the way, I'm not perfect. I know this is going to come as a shock to some. And I have to say that one thing that both critics of Christianity and some elements of Christianity tend to forget is that Christianity believes that all of us, every single one of us, is a sinner in God's eyes, no matter how hard we try not to be. But he loves us anyway, and he forgives us. And therefore, it kind of behooves us to extend that same approach to others, even if they aren't fellow Christians, or even if they're making life choices that we might not approve of. Okay? One of the things that us evangelicals say say a lot, and other people don't really, I think, follow, is that it is possible to hate the sin and love the sinner. Okay? And that we're supposed to do that. We're supposed to believe in the regeneration of humans who understand, you know what, I need to change this in my life, and that they can do that. Okay? And so the notion of forgiving somebody, you know, we may say, well, okay, we're glad that you have found religion and so forth. But those 43 people who murdered and buried in shallow graves first still require that the state not just say, yes, you can go now. Okay, kind of thing. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we are supposed to be able, we're supposed to at least try to make that adjustment. I have a friend in California, Kemal, whose father is an imam. And he's an American-born Muslim. And he says, if you think American Catholics have it hard, you should try being an American-born Muslim, because over 90% of you that don't have black Muslims, over 90% of all Muslims in the United States today are immigrants. And it's against that background that he is trying to practice his religion as an American Muslim. And they come, we're talking about people coming from a totally different societal template. And Islam, of course, really emphasizes the community of the believers, and you're all supposed to support each other. His dad has gotten dozens of death threats from fellow Muslims because he isn't sufficiently radical for them. He's not sufficiently fundamentalist. And I had a conversation with Kemal at one point. He said, well, you know, there's been a lot of talk about whether or not Islam is the enemy. And he says, I'm here to tell you that right now it is. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, all right, go back to the 1640s, 1630s. You guys were depopulating Germany over religion. You were burning down Magdeburg, you know, just basically killing everybody in sight. Okay, well, that was about 1,600 years after Christ's death. Muhammad was like 8th century, years 821. We're actually precocious. We're getting to it now. Okay. And he said that he feels that a big part of what happened is that in the 19th century, people in the Muslim world, particularly places like Turkey and the Middle East, looked at the widening gap between Western capabilities and technology and so forth. And they went into the sciences and they wanted to close the gap. They became engineers, they became bankers, they became lawyers. They embraced these Western institutions trying to, okay, the folks who didn't embrace them, who didn't want to embrace them, got left home to run the religion. And he says, so in effect, what happened is the element that should have been humanizing Islam, bringing Islam from the 9th century into the 20th century, we're out doing secular things. And we left the growth of our religion in the hands of people who wanted to turn the 9th century back to the 8th century. And he said, until Islam deals with that internally, he said, you Christians better watch your ass. So I didn't put it. And I was like, well, gee, thanks. He said, well, I just thought I'd tell you, I mean, after all, you're all heathens and idolaters, and that you tell us you're monotheistic, but we know we really worship three. So it's like, yeah, well, I know all about Muhammad being the perfect man, and he's like, well, we won't talk about it. so the good thing is that we can have these discussions, but he can have them with me, and he can't have them with a lot of his fellow Muslims. Just as my church, it's a small southern church, suffered significant damage as a congregation when we were invited to attend a Ramadan feast in which the Muslims would describe their religion and their beliefs to us, and we would share ours. And there were a couple of members of our congregation who stood up and quoted James about, you had nothing to do with these people. They are the work of the devil. He's talking, and James is speaking specifically about people who claim to be followers of Christ, but we're going off in a different direction. But these people were applying it to Islam as the work of the devil, and it will, you are doing Satan's will if you have converse with them. Okay. Now my theory is, okay, nobody on either side was going to this dinner with the purpose of converting anybody on the other side. I mean, obviously I would be delighted if Kemal decided, next week that he might have become Christian. In a Muslim country, he would then be subject to the death penalty for doing that. But the fact that Kemal is not a Christian does not prevent me from treasuring him as a very dear friend. Okay, it doesn't mean that I don't know that he would step in front of a train to pull one of my kids out of the way. Okay, it's the same way with gays. Okay, the Bible does teach, okay, that homosexuality is frowned upon by God. Okay, does that? But what I was going to say is, does the fact that I believe that is what the Bible says, does that mean that God doesn't love somebody just because they're homosexual? Of course it doesn't mean that. Okay? Does it mean that they should be denied the same sort of relationship with the person that they love that I have with the person that I love, including not having legal disabilities inflicted upon them? Of course I believe they should. Okay? And so this is one of those areas where that whole, hate the sin, love the sinner comes into play for me. And for most of the people I know who truly consider Christians. By me. And there's that whole thing in there about judge not, lest you be judged. A better translation of that is condemn not, lest you be condemned. Okay, because every human being, every Christian is expected to make judgment calls every day, all right, in every way. Now, there's a difference between judging, I think that's a good idea, and judging, I think that's a bad idea, and therefore, that's one step in the journey to hell. Okay. I don't think God really likes scorekeepers, okay? And on Grayson, to kind of pull this back on the topic, if you've been to panels before, you know me kind of
Grayson's not coming back to the topic?
Actually, it works that way in my books sometimes. Anyway.
So we're good.
But on Grayson, the concept of the believer meeting the hour of his or her test is central to the Grayson philosophy. Now, remember I was saying that the Wesleyan quadrilateral, Wesley didn't think all four branches, all four elements had to be constrained. He believed that without being touched by the Spirit and moved by the Spirit to understand, the other three would really avail you nothing in the end. Okay, and this is clearly this is part of Grayson's thinking too. But the test is much more. It's the intellectual test of the quadrilateral assumes much greater importance on Grayson than it does for most Methodists today. I mean, we apply it. At least we do if we're being thoughtful about what we say we believe. Okay. But because of the nature of the experience of Grayson, where they go to the planet they expect to be eaten and find out that it's really kind of purgatory. Okay. The doctrine of the test, which was always part of their religion, assumed a different base, a different strength. And the notion that God tests those he loves in order to help them grow is where they took that original Wesleyan concept
Those he
and
loves, he
moved it.
chastises.
Beg your pardon?
Those he loves, he chastises.
Yes, but the question is, why does he chastise? All right, does he chastise to punish us because he loves us and we're going astray, Or does he punish us because, okay, my son Michael, my son Michael, he's like 4 years old. I sent him to his room. He's sitting on his bed at the head of the stairs. I don't want to be in my room! Over and over and over again. And so I stopped. And I said, you don't want to sit in your room? No! Good. Close the door and left. He said, silence! I don't want to. So I waited a few minutes and came back and I went, I said, are you unhappy about sitting in your room? He said, yes! And I said, good, that means I'm doing my job. And closed the door. And finally, when the time came and he was let out of his room, I said, now, Mikey, do you understand why you were in there? Because you were mad at me. But why was I mad at you? He's like, I said, you're doing something you weren't supposed to do? He says, yeah. And I said, is it my job to teach you not to do things you're not supposed to do? And he was kind of like, he knew the answer was supposed to be yes, but he didn't like it. And I said, so if you were unhappy while you were sitting in there, I was doing my job, which was to make you unhappy enough. You won't do it again, And of course, with Mikey, that really kind of requires a baseball bat. I don't know where he gets it. Mom's Irish. We were talking to a friend of ours, Candy Smith, who is she's a pediatric counselor. Okay, and we were talking. Yeah, Mikey and Daddy are kind of locking horns a lot these days. And I actually took what she had said and incorporated it into I Will Build My House of Steel. Because she said, well, physically, Mikey is a clone of Sharon. Red hair, skin smokes in moonlight. Kind of thing. Sunscreen hell, we need lunar screen. She said, but intellectually, he's you in miniature. And that's why you're locked in homes. Okay, because you are so much alike. Now, she also explained that, boys think in linear patterns, straight patterns. They don't do subtle. Girls do subtle. Girls are like, sure, Dad, whatever you want. And then they go do whatever they were going to do anyway. And they're being kind to you because they don't want you to be upset knowing that they're doing something you don't want them to do. The problem is the verb that you want in there is knowing that they're doing something, and their verb is knowing that they're doing something, if you see what I'm saying. As long as you don't know, we're keeping you happy, we're happy, everything's fine.
That's my new part of stuff.
Yeah, well, yeah, kind of, sort of, and I have, it's kind of like my daughters, Megan and Morgan, are very much like that. And we discovered, by the way, that we gave them the wrong names. Because they figured out what happens if you drop the G's out of their names. Morgan becomes moron. And Megan becomes mean. Addressing one another, We should have named you Fred and Joe, But it's like Megan, Elizabeth, Moni, Rob, Rice Weber. The first time they have to fill out all the little boxes, we're going to wake up and they're on the bed. We hate you! Morgan is Morgan, Emily, Moni, Rob, Rice Weber. And because we knew that we didn't dare not have the same number of names for everybody, Michael is Michael, Paul, Alexander, Rice Weber. And we managed to get most of the grandparents on both sides, covered in that. But it does give us this, Michael, Alex, Paul, Alexander, Rice Weber. Oh boy, he knows what he's doing. Well, you have to, okay, and here, just, Megan, this is like 2 years ago, so pray for me, okay? This was 2 years ago. We're sitting there, I'm the cook, and she's helping me in the kitchen, and I asked her if she'd done one stage of the prep, and she looked at me, she said, well, duh. And her mom is sitting there at the table. Sharon does not cook. Sharon is an excellent cook. It's just the way white boiled water. She said that, not me. I just use it because it's so apropos. She's sitting at the table when this happens, and she says, "Is that how we speak to our Father?" And Megan sort of thinks about it a minute. She puts her hand on her hip and gives her head a little bit. She says, "Well, duh." Okay, that's 16 is going to be ugly. But they're wonderful. We had to fight with the INS program here before we got to bring the girls home, and Mikey is an IVF after the boss along the way. So all three of them are miracle children, and all three of them were every single thing we went through together. There are times when it's a little hard to remember that. And that too is really part of where I am with Grayson's attitude towards children. Now you have to understand, Grayson's attitude towards children was part of where I was coming from long before Morgan and Megan and Michael Paul were anywhere near the horizon. You know, the girls were born in Cambodia, and so they already had people asking them, "Is Honor Harrington your age?" And we had to do it. They thought that the correct answer to that is Honor Harrington was born in 1991. We were born in 2001.
Yes.
Okay, so, no. Yeah, I didn't know they were coming at the time. Had I known they were coming, then there very well might have been a deliberate connection in there. It's pure serendipity. But anyway, get back to religion on Grayson. Does anybody have a question about religion? Well, I think your hand may come first.
My thing is more of a
Yeah.
it's sort of the one thing that was interesting, obviously, was children and
the second fall, or the theory of the second fall.
that's not sure is
But it's how many daughters do you already have? And the biggest difference, this is another factor in cultures like this, historically, in our historical experience. While infanticide has been available as a means of birth control, and female infanticide has been practiced far more than male infanticide, abortion as a way to simply prevent an unwanted pregnancy from taking its course has not been. I mean, there have been abortifactants and whatnot that have been available that tend to kill the women involved on many occasions. And you have to understand that Masada is not simply patriarchal, it's misogynist, profoundly misogynist. They blame women for what happened on Grayson. That's why I was getting to the second fall. Okay? And so women are not simply inferior, and it's certainly nothing to do with the protect women element that is so central to Grayson's patriarchy. Okay? It's that they see this as a situation in which we are all being punished because of the misdeeds of women. And therefore, they have to be, you got to keep an eye on them every single instant, because if you give them a scrap of power, they're going to do it to us all over again. Okay, I mean, and they've got Barbara Bancroft to look at to validate their belief. And that's why, like Elder Simons, they didn't find all the pieces of his body once his wives figured out that they wouldn't all be killed if he were to suffer a mischief. Okay? So, Masada, more than I think some people realize, it's kind of like Beowulf and Mesa. You know, they're the dark face of each other. All right? That's what Masada is to Grayson. all right? And they have so dedicated themselves. That's why, you know, they removed the entire New Testament from their Bibles, all right? Because Christ could not possibly have been the Messiah, or we wouldn't have, God would not have done this to us all over again. You see what I'm saying? And I actually had somebody who wrote me a letter and accused me of anti-Semitism because I had used the name Masada, and because after all, if you removed the New Testament from the Christian Bible, what do you have? Okay, obviously you think they were the Jews, and this is our stuff. And I'm like, my great-grandmother was Ukrainian Jewish who walked barefoot from Ukraine to Bohemia as the only survivor of her family after the Black Hundreds came through. So no, I'm not especially anti-Semitic in my thinking. And part of the point that was being made is, to begin with, the original defenders of Masada really could have sat down and drunk beer, except they didn't, with ISIS in terms of their religious fervor. Okay, they were Jews, they were zealots, and they were in a position where, in the end, they all killed themselves, right? And empowered by their religion. I'm not trying to take anything away from them in that respect. What I'm saying is that when you are that deeply invested in your religious beliefs, and when you are willing to go to those extremes for them, you have definitely entered the area of extremists, okay? There's actually, I have a Schuler on Satan make the comment that extremism in the name of God can never be a sin, more or less, okay? The other side of it, though, is what I was doing is I was deliberately taking the fact that anybody can appropriate a trope and twist it to his or her own ends, which is precisely what the Masadians did when they moved to Masada. They saw themselves as being exiled from Grayson, that wonderful planet, to a planet where they could actually raise families, not worry about dying, etc. As they got the bad side of the deal. And the Graysons are like, I wonder why they think that way, you know. But if you wrap your mind into that shape, when you get into other pretzel forms, it gets much easier. Mark, there's another hand back here.
It seems to me that the precept of the test in Grayson has elements of the Society of Friends here today.
It does, to some extent. The Society of Friends, the biggest difference is that Grayson has a very clearly delineated church hierarchy and officially sanctioned doctrine. And that really is the fundamental tension at the heart of the Church of Grayson, which realistically would be the hardest to sustain. And that's why Reverend Hanks tells Honor that, you know, the church has had its periods of extremism and zealotry and learned from them. He's talking in part about their experience with Masada. Well, their experience with the faithful really makes it easier to have a check kind of here on wild hair, if you will, development of religious sects and whatnot. The doctrine of the test means that they can't be suppressive of those other, but they can, to go back to the Society of Friends, they can in effect shun you. They can say, okay, fine, this is what your belief requires you to do, and we respect you for that, but until your teachings and your beliefs are back within the acceptable variation of the Church of Humanity Unchanged's doctrine and theology, you're going to have to meet your challenge on your own. Okay, we will still love you, we won't, you know, and there will be, and you'll notice there are a lot of Graysons who are the intolerance, what is the Baptist Church, Westville or whatever it is, Westboro, with 5 members, you know, over here it gives all Baptists like a really, really bad name. Okay, well, unfortunately, the rest of the Baptists can't keep them from calling themselves Baptists. All right, Grayson can say, all right, you're not part of the Church of Humanity Unchained. You're not part of the synod, you know, whatever. So that's important because it means that the Church of Humanity Unchained has a certain degree of insulation from the lunatics. All right?
You can't like just sort of stand and take over because they'll kick you out of the door.
Well, and also it means that the lunatics can't brand themselves as we're part of the Church of Humanity Unchained. One of the things that happens, and you see this in where some of the churches today are going in terms of their social policies. This happens in political parties too. The folks who work hardest to influence the direction of any organization are the people who have the strongest beliefs, the most zeal for what they're doing. I'm deliberately avoiding the word zealot here to the moment. Okay. Well, as they begin to move the organization or the denomination in the direction of their beliefs, the people who disagree with them become increasingly dissatisfied, and they begin dropping out. And so then you lose the check on the zeal of the folks who are driving the organization in this direction. It begins to get to the point where people who were moderates to begin with are now finding themselves regarded as conservative or reactionary within the political movement or the denomination. So they drop out. And so the folks, it gets driven farther and farther to an extreme. And you can see that, for example, in what's happened to the American Episcopal Church. They've had a huge drop in membership, partly because they have driven the social agenda of the church faster and farther than the majority, not all by any means, but then the majority of the Episcopal Church wanted to go at that time. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the current leadership of the Episcopal Church is wrong. I think that they push too hard, too fast, and I think that they have in some ways become more enamored of being, I speak as someone, like I say, who's raised in Episcopalians, even though I'm a Methodist, that's not knocking somebody I never had anything to do with. I think that they push too hard and too fast, and that they are more concerned with the social agenda than they are with biblical teaching in many ways right now today. I think that many Christians forget that you're supposed to read the operator's manual. Okay? How many of us get the operator's manual for the printer and just put it on the bookshelf and say, if something breaks, I'll figure out how it works? Okay, well, that's what a lot of Christians do with the Bible. Okay, and I speak as someone who did that. Okay, I've now been through the entire thing 3 times, although I lived it the second, third time through. I skipped Leviticus and Deuteronomy. I'm sorry, I just kept going to sleep reading Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Well, I actually read a very interesting book years ago, in which the author, who is a lawyer, examines how much of our common law tradition is based on the Old Testament. And it is incredible, if you go back and look, the foundations of Roman and Western law in the later empire and today, hugely influenced by the concept of law in the Old Testament. But that's how religions develop in the U.S. Okay, that's how denominations develop and progress. They're not necessarily Christianity. One of the huge differences between Christianity and Islam, you can, by Islamic law, you cannot print a Quran in any language except Arabic. You may print one in which there is a secular translation included, but the Arabic text must be there. Okay, Christians are incredibly promiscuous. Oh, there's a language we haven't translated it into yet. Quickly, go do it. Because for Christians, the message, getting it out, is the important, most critical thing. Okay? If you look at the history of Christianity, there is no society that Christianity has ever infected which has not been profoundly changed by Christianity. The converse is, there is no society that Christianity has ever infested which has not, in its turn, affected Christianity. All right, and we're okay with that, by and large. We're okay with the fact that there are certain fundamental guiding principles in here, but there's a lot of room for flex outside that. And if you look at the mainstream of Christian theology, doctrine, especially since the 17th century. So we're talking, all right, just last here. There is, you see some of that same understanding. There will always be more for us to learn in the doctrinal approach that is taken. Okay, now you will find some folks, like I come from Greenville, South Carolina. We got Bob Jones University. Okay. And these days, actually, Bob Jones has made it at least into the last quarter of the 20th century, which is, from where they were when I was a kid, it's incredible. And I'm not trying to, trust me, living in Greenville, you know a lot of Bob Jones graduates, okay? And they are among the nicest, most generous people you're ever going to meet, okay? But their position was, for the first 50, 60 years of their existence, that they had not changed at all from their founding principles. Okay, they still haven't changed from their founding principles, but they have changed from the degree to which the corollaries of the principles governed everything they did, to back to what are our real core principles. And they find out that the core principles that they had really, this whole thing about, we have no blacks on campus, kind of thing, that was actually a violation of what our core principles were, because we were in the wrong direction, okay? And they had the courage internally to admit that to themselves. Now, do I agree with them politically and so forth in a lot of ways even today? No. But when I look at where they were relative to the world around them 40 years ago when I was in my 20s, yes, I'm that old, and where they are today, okay, the gap between that has been, and they managed to do it without losing their sense of identity and staying true to themselves.
Well,
And
that
that's
sounds
hard.
like Clint Scales, to be honest.
It is Clint Scales. But Clint Scales was able to do what he did because of the doctrine of the test. Okay? Honor rubbed his face in the fact that he obviously had been wrong. And he, just by being who she was, and after that assassination attempt, he's the one who has, okay, I've made the leap. Okay, you're a military officer. Okay, and I got wounded in the line of duty, and I went right on doing what I needed to do, so I understand exactly where you're coming from. And he was the only person in the room that was true of. Okay, now, most of the other people who were in that room at that time eventually made the transition. Not all Graysons have even today. And you are going to have folks like Burdett, who are like, we think this is a really bad idea still today. But remember, you're like almost 20 years down the road in what was a pre-prolonged society. So most of the folks who were around before honor came along are getting steadily older. And the youngest of the people who got prolonged were like Michael Mayhew. They were 20-somethings or younger. All right, so this is when you're in the most flexible part of your life in terms of what you're prepared to believe and accept. So another 20, 30 years, Grayson is going to be much more, you had your hand up.
Yeah.
I know, I just keep going past
Just
you.
keep changing what I'm thinking because of the specific topic, but, so I won't ask the question I was going to ask about the changing the birthdays and Grayson go to the test. It seems to me, and I am Grayson, and I really relate to that whole idea of the test because I was raised one way, found that I didn't think that I quite agreed with my parents on their interpretations of things, and so kind of did that thing, but it seems like the very fact that Graysons are raised with the idea that they are expected to invest intellectual and emotional energy in their understanding of doctrine and scripture makes it a little less brittle for them when they do have to say, you know what, I think I was wrong about that.
Yeah.
They're expected to make mistakes and learn, and it's not a matter of, I am getting this from on high, I'm the only one with the right answer, so if I change my mind, I have now invalidated everything I ever said. They can say one thing different without invalidating everything.
That's hugely central to where we're supposed to be as Christians. Okay, we're supposed to be learning daily in our lives. Now, I, of course, have already learned everything. But the rest of you are supposed to be learning every day in your life. Okay, how many people know the story of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien? We know that Lewis was raised in the Church of the Resurrection. Tolkien was fundamental in bringing Lewis back to the church because they both served in World War I. Okay. And Tolkien's faith had survived his time on the Western Front. And Lewis, in writing about this later, says, you know, I was raised in the church, but no one actually taught me what I was being raised in. And therefore, when Tolkien he started to take the church fathers, and remember what Lewis's academic specialization was. Okay, when he starts getting look at this, he's had his road to Damascus moment, his road to Emmaus moment. I mean, you know, the scales are off his eyes, and that is the way that he's reconstructing this later, and he's looking at this from a totally different perspective, even though he was raised in the church. I happen to believe that one reason that Islam has made such inroads in Europe is the fact that so many Europeans who think they were raised Christian have never actually been exposed to the operator. Okay? And the problem is, and also because Europe is a lot more prey to relativism than Americans are even today, cultural and moral relativism. It's kind of like, you know, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. Don't try that with the law of gravity. Bad things will happen. All right? And if you get into the area of moral behavior, moral beliefs, the same thing will happen. If you simply take your foot off the brake completely, if you remove the concept of moral absolutism, there is a right and there is a wrong, then you remove any reason to choose between the two. Okay? And you start drifting into an ambiguity that leaves you with no anchor. But human beings want anchors. There is something in the human psyche that I think is actually evidence of the existence of God, which is that we yearn for that connection to something, right? Some of us find it in politics, some of us find it there. But there's that yearning, that sense that we are not somehow quite complete, and we're reaching for that completion. All right, so here I am. I'm a European. I was raised theoretically in a Christian society, and I'm finding myself in a world of grades, where there are no black and white choices. I'm not saying that a lot of moral choices aren't shades of gray, but there are some that darn well ought to be black and white. All right? And we're finding ourselves without them. And then here comes someone who says, here are the 5 pillars of Islam. Okay, do these, follow this. It's the absolute moral guidance, the compass that you didn't have, that I am providing for you. And so, Christianity fails them. And Islam supplies the need that Christianity didn't. And it isn't Christianity that fails. It's the church that failed by not giving them that compass, that sense of who they are and where they need to be. And I'm not saying that Christianity is the only way you can get there. But what I'm saying is that because they think they were raised Christian, and because they have that failure in their lives, you know, if they thought that they had been raised Buddhist, and yet they felt that drift in their lives, then they would be looking for something to provide that sense of connection, that sense of guidance. And they might find it in Christianity, not Islam. But that's what they're looking for. And I think that's why Islam has made the kind of inroads that it's made in Europe right now. I've already did YouTube. Yes, there was a hand back there. Oh, it's James Oswald.
So currently, I'm in college, and 2 of my classes, including my fire company officer, are talking about communication and where we get our moral compass from. And what they're teaching is that the root of our moral compass does not come from communities, it comes from the family.
That's probably true.
And I'm just wondering if that is part of where Masada comes from. I mean, it comes from your mother's milk kind of thing.
There's a reason why, especially in Christianity, we talk a lot about your church family, the family of the church. Okay, we're all supposed to be brothers and sisters and so forth, and you know, always like all your brothers and sisters. But home is where, when you go there, they have to take you back. Okay, and that's really, in some ways, what the church is. The church is supposed to be a family of people teaching the rules. The problem is, and some parents are pretty bad about this, they teach you the rules without teaching you the reason the rules are the rules. And so instead of saying, well, I need to remember, you know, to never run out of the front of the car because it will squash me, what happens is you resent the hell out of the rule that says, why can't I cross against the light? I want to be over there now. Okay? And if you're lucky, you find out the hard way when you wake up in the hospital. All right? And this is a fundamental failing of religions of all stripes. Is I'm going to teach you the rules, and then you're in. Okay? And then you start clinging to the rules. It's kind of, remember what I was saying about organizations becoming more radical? Okay, the other side of it is they become more ossified. Because, okay, these are the rules. There's a song by the Gaither group that is making music with my friends. You know it? And there's a line in it that says, we try to make things complicated, build temples out of stone, build books with lots of rules about the way. But if we'd stop and listen and break a little bread, we just might hear the master say. And what he's saying is, love each other. Okay? That's it. That's the big rule. And all of the other stuff, you know, if you look at all the 10 Commandments, okay, every one of them is something you would be doing anyway if you loved the people that you're interacting with. All right? We tend to think about the Old Testament as this judgmental, here's the God of the hatchet kind of thing. But if you actually look, you know, all he's saying over and over again, hey guys, come on back. All right? And that's one of the things to me that is absolutely fascinating about the Jews and the Old Testament is it is such a truthful document. If you look at how they write about themselves, how they write about David and Solomon and the Jewish people falling away from God, and God constantly saying, come back, you know, and yes, you're going to get in trouble. It's going to be bad. You know, that Babylonian captivity, man, it's coming to come on back, you know. And so Christ, yes, there's a new covenant, but it's the old covenant, all right? And this gets lost, the fact that God is the same. Okay, I didn't mean to get into proselytizing here. but it's something that we kind of okay, constantly.
Coming out to destroy it. Remind you what I was talking about before you got it cluttered up.
And when I said, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, with all thy, and love thy neighbor as thyself. These are the two great laws. From them descend all the law and the commandments. And in that moment, what he's telling you is, this is what the rule book is about. Okay? This is, and that's why you have to explain, like to Mikey, why he had to sit in his room when he didn't want to be there. All right? And the Graysons have managed to do that. See, I got it back on top. But that's no, it doesn't work. But that's one of the things that the Grayson theology and doctrine has learned and managed to do. What time is it?
It is
7 till
8 till 6.
Okay, so we have time for a couple more questions. I think you had your hand up first, and then I think it was you, and then I think it was you if we get that far. Okay, I promise. Otherwise, you can grab me in the hall. Yeah.
Okay.
About the Grayson plural marriages, I understand why it would have developed on Grayson because of the low male birth rate, like 30%, and like 1/3 are boys, and they're stillborn and everything, and there's a lot of girls. That makes sense because it's happened historically. Now, from reading The Honor of the Queen and some of the other books, it happened before they left Earth. What? Or did
They practiced polygamy, but it wasn't necessarily expected and required. Okay, the church of Mary and James across the Grayson recognized that you could have a deep, sincere, loving relationship with more than one person at a time.
And that's happened in the other denominations.
Yeah, well, Masada took it and twisted it like they did everything else from both the Book of the New Way and the Bible. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so half the panel is marriage practices. So I'll ask another marriage practice question is, how do you see Grayson marriages evolving now that we don't have the disparity?
Well, there's not any religious law on Grayson that requires a man to have multiple wives. And if you notice, Mayhew only has 2 instead of the traditional 3 or more. All right. So I suspect that you will eventually see a wide disparity in numbers of spouses. You may actually eventually see a situation in which you have 2 husbands and 1 wife, because Tess is going to require them to say, well, wait, there's nowhere in the rule book where it says. I read a very interesting article about gay marriage that said gay marriage became inevitable with the notion of marriage as something besides a family alliance was set aside in favor of the notion of marrying the person you love. Okay, and I think there's really a fair amount of truth to that. Wait a minute, I have one more question. I promised her I'd get to it. Yeah.
Okay, back. Hit you with another one of the marriage questions. Woo-hoo.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're coming off of Grayson. We've got Grayson women coming off and going mostly through the law mandatory maybe because it's a line that's now set. They can get out going that way. So if things are intolerable and all, it's a quick out. But they still have those mindsets.
Some of them have them more strongly than others. Okay, think about it this way. Grayson is at where traditional lifestyles that were enforced by external circumstances, reinforced by external factors, those external factors no longer apply. Okay? And they're being exposed, hugely exposed, thrown into contact with the rest of the galaxy, and specifically with their greatest military ally and benefactor, and a society in which nobody in Mandalore, whether they liked it or not, ever questioned whether or not they could be a starship captain. Okay, so they're going into a society. And I think it's Bernard Yannicott, in his conversation with Raul Cravatier, who actually puts it in, he says, you forced us to consider that we've been wrong all this time. And it's not as hard for us as you might think because of the doctrine of the test. But it's going to take us time. But Grayson is a lot more open to that kind of tectonic shift than almost any other highly traditional culture you could conceive of would be, because part of their tradition is the notion that they could be wrong. Okay? Now, you're going to see Abigail Hearns is an extraordinary example of a Grayson woman. But in Joelle's short story, Obligated Service, you kind of see the other side of it.
The young one becomes legally the head of the family.
Yes, but it's also, it's like the situation that she's coming from is very different from the one that Abigail is coming from. And in essence, you're seeing somebody from the wrong side of the tracks in an area which is intensely conservative to begin with, dealing with, and not even seeing some of the clues about what's going on. They're going right by her there initially with what she thinks the captain of her new ship is doing and what she thinks her fellow midshipwoman is doing and where they're coming from, because that's the prism through which she's seen, and that's the way we all live. The difference between prejudice and bigotry is that prejudice is based on a consideration of facts we think we know, and bigotry is based on a commodity of facts. Okay? And so we all suffer from prejudice. And prejudice is actually useful in some ways. Bigotry is never useful, okay, and is easier.